Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lord Gord Podcast. This is your host, Lord Gord, and I'm giving you information that's factually correct and politically incorrect. And I've been a little irked and upset lately with all the nonsense going on. I read in an email that the California leftist liberal fascists are trying to take control of the healthcare industry. They're trying to control costs. They're trying to tell health insurance companies how much they can charge, what they need to provide, so on and so forth. Yeah, that's never ended badly before. So this week, I'm going to talk about something I deal with on a daily basis and a set of ideas that have led to chaos, dysfunction, criminality, illegitimacy, and failure on this side of the Atlantic and on the other side of the Atlantic. And I am discussing the underclass today. So let's get into it. What is the underclass and who are its constituents? Personally, I think of these people as the bizarro Chinese. Kind of like how Superman is the superhero and he saves the day and he's a good guy, and bizarro Superman is the opposite. The underclass is the bizarro Chinese. The Chinese value education, family, and savings. The underclass is almost a complete opposite. Members of the underclass engage in reckless sexual behavior, are prone to violence, they shun education and work, they celebrate and perpetuate criminality, social deviance, and they lack class. They live in a sea of chaos, mired in illegitimacy, revolving doors of intimate partners, violence, a lack of impulse control, and are strict adherents to the creeds of moral and cultural relativism. Their self-destructive behaviors are usually subsidized by welfare states, and their behaviors are apologized for by leftist politicians and leftist academics. They can hardly be classified as civilized if one is being charitable, and they are the dregs of our society and societies all across the world. So let me get into, I'm going to do a few examples of the underclass, and my first example will be the American black underclass, which is mired in illegitimacy, crime, social deviance, and intellectualism. So let me give you some numbers here. Blacks make up 12% of the U.S. population, but from 1975 onwards, they have committed 52% of the murders. 25% of all murders occur in 4 U.S. cities: Baltimore, D.C., Chicago, and Detroit. Okay? Check out my podcast on black crime if you want more details on that. But all those cities have been Democrat-run for decades, and they have a black crime problem. That's not a coincidence, though. Their illegitimacy rate is close to 80% today, but in 1960 it was only 23%. Over 60% of blacks under the age of 18 live at home with one parent. 39.8% of all welfare recipients in the country are black, even though they are only 12% of the population. So let me give you an example of this dysfunction. In the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago, this is in 1980, women headed 90% of the families with children. And 81% of those households were on welfare. 11% of all Chicago murders happened in the Robert Taylor homes, even though only 1% of the population lived there. And I did a podcast on illegitimacy, but being born out of wedlock, growing up without a father, you're 20 times more likely to go to prison. You're 5 times more likely to be poor. You're 3 times more likely to fail in school. And various studies I've read have shown that about 70% of all kids in juvenile detention facilities come from single-parent homes. Over 90% of welfare recipients are single mothers. About 70% of gang members, teen drug addicts, teen pregnancies, they come from fatherless homes. So it's a big problem. So I'm going to tell you guys some of my personal stories about the black underclass. Let me give you an example. This happened to me twice in a local AutoZone near my house here in South Central LA. I was standing behind a black guy. I mean, this is virtually identical scenarios with two different black people. I was standing behind this black guy, and both times they say, hey, back up or I'll knock you out. So they threatened me with violence. And did I move? Of course not. I'm not a punk, and I'm not going to let someone boss me around. But it's that quick inclination towards violence that really makes up the underclass. Another example of how these people act, you can go to the Slauson swap meet, and when they sell T-shirts, you see T-shirts of people who celebrate criminality and are involved in a criminal lifestyle. And I remember telling someone this. I said, you don't see that in any other culture. You go to Chinatown, they're not going to be selling T-shirts with pictures of criminals and people who celebrate criminality. You're not going to see that in the white community. You do see it with the Hispanics. They have a lot of those T-shirts that show the Hispanic gangbangers and stuff on them. I remember even seeing some toys. They're called homies or whatnot. These little toys with these Hispanic gang members and degenerates. They used to sell those toys. I'm going to get into the Hispanic underclass later, but even going to school with some of these people, they don't value education. They're loud, they're obnoxious, they dress like criminals, and they are dogmatic. If you do anything outside the norm, outside their chaotic, dysfunctional norm, they will tease you. They will make fun of you. And the way they view the world is that someone owes them something for nothing, that they're entitled to something, that they don't have to work for anything, and all their failures are due to the fault of other people. They are sympathetic towards criminals. I was talking to my mom about this. I said, O.J. Simpson murdered 2 people, and he had the complete support of the black establishment and the black underclass. But when Clarence Thomas was being accused of sexual harassment, none of those people in the black establishment or the underclass came to defend Clarence Thomas. I was telling my mom, these people are more sympathetic with criminals in the criminal lifestyle than they are with blacks that advocate for personal responsibility, small government, individual liberty, and free markets. It really is abhorrent. And if you want to look at black degeneracy, just look at the rap music, and I say music loosely. Most of their songs talk about criminality, violence, social deviance. They're calling each other the N-word. They're talking about selling drugs and all kinds of lewd acts with women. Listen to my podcast about why hip-hop's the worst musical idea ever. I get into it there, but even living in my neighborhood, that's all you hear coming from these cars, and it's extremely loud, and it's obnoxious. And you have to realize that these songs are hymns of the thug world. These thugs and vagabonds and criminals identify with that stuff because that is the way they live. That is a preferred lifestyle. It is. And how these black degenerates are so quick to defend criminals and murderers. Look at this guy, Stephon Clark, for example. This guy had a long rap sheet. He was breaking into cars. He disobeyed police orders, and he got shot. And everyone is defending this criminal, and they're attacking the police. You'll never see that in the white community. You will not see that in the Asian community. You'll probably see it in the Hispanic community or any other dysfunctional community. But in functional, stable communities with an actual moral compass, you won't see this kind of behavior. So let me give you some examples of some of these ghetto names I've seen. Another hallmark of the black underclass is they completely shun the values and behavior of the dominant dysfunction. Then the dominant society is racist and is trying to keep them down, so on and so forth. So let me give you some examples of some of these ghetto names. Sir Coleon, Sean Travius, Lil Jordan, Quandarius, Nautica, Aramik, Deasia Rameki, Shanayal, Takia, spelled T''Keyah. Do those names sound like the names of people who are going to be engineers or doctors or pediatricians or accountants or lawyers? Or do they sound like the names of criminals, vagabonds, and welfare recipients? Do these sound like the names that civilized, educated, sophisticated, mature black families with a mother and father give to their children? No, though I can almost guarantee you all those people come from single parent homes. I can almost guarantee it. So let me give you some more examples of this depravity. This is I was reading this in Tom Sowell's book, Wealth, Poverty, and Politics. Black parents, on average, have less than half as many books in their homes as white American parents. And that can't be solely a matter of economics, because black parents in the highest socioeconomic quintile have slightly fewer books in their homes than white parents in the lowest socioeconomic quintile. A study of affluent black youth in Shaker Heights found that blacks lagged far behind their white peers academically. They spent far less time studying. There was an actual aversion to behaviors regarded as acting white. The white behavior, most often singled out for criticism, was speaking standard English. The researchers said that what amazed them was that the kids coming from the homes of doctors and lawyers aren't thinking like their parents, and they don't know how their parents made it. They are looking up to rappers and ghettos as their role models. And I can definitely attest to that through personal experience and seeing that in my lifetime in ghetto schools all across the country. You know, the criminal lifestyle, the lifestyle of these idiot rappers is a preferred lifestyle. These people are idolized. They're celebrated. They celebrate a guy who advocated for thug life. They sell this guy's picture on t-shirts. They talk about him like he was a saint. He advocated for criminality and violence, yet he is celebrated in large swaths of the black community. People have to understand that this culture of criminality, violence, social deviance, illegitimacy, and deflection is not a subculture. This is the dominant culture of black America. Of course, you have people who don't ascribe to that at all, who don't behave like black rednecks. They study, they work hard, they save, they marry people before having babies. But the reality is, if your out of wedlock birth rate is 72%, if your abortion rate is almost 3 times the white abortion rate, you cannot tell me that this is a culture of morality. You can't tell me that. All the evidence says otherwise. All the evidence shows the fact that these people are more willing to defend criminals and to blame everyone else for the criminal behavior in black communities all over the country than take responsibility for their own actions. I've even seen a video of this one time. It was this kid in Arkansas, I believe. He was about 14 years old. This kid kills a white kid, shoots him dead. And all these people in the community, they come up with this video, and they're saying that the murderer should be given justice because he's a kid, and he should be tried as a kid. He murdered another human being. Nowhere in the video did they say that they are sorry that this kid committed a senseless act of violence against an innocent individual that deprived 2 parents of their son that they will never get back. No, they're trying to cover for a murderer, saying that a murderer should not pay for the ramifications of his actions, that he should be tried as a juvenile and not an adult. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time. That is what the problem is with this black underclass. Instead of shunning these criminals and telling them to go away and trying to fix their communities and make them economically viable, they cover for these criminals. They blame everyone else, and that's why they're mired in poverty. and dysfunction. Let me read you a quote from Jason Riley's book, False Black Power, before I move on to the white British underclass. So, quote, "The evidence that factors other than a lack of job opportunities may contribute significantly to high black unemployment rates dates back decades and is more than anecdotal. In 1986, the National Bureau of Economic Research released a detailed study of poor communities in Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago. It found that almost half of black youths who were not in school and not working said it was very easy or somewhat easy to find a job working as a laborer, and 71% said the same of landing a minimum wage job. The researchers also reported that the typical out-of-school, non-employed black youth in the ghetto wasn't especially focused on enhancing his or her employment prospects. Instead, the youths reported spending most of their time on hanging out, TV and movies, listening to music, or getting high, as opposed to searching for jobs, reading, or working around the house." Here's another study from Harvard economist Richard Freeman. He said that nearly a third of the youths said that they can earn more from criminal activity than from legitimate work, and those who committed crimes, who used drugs or drank, who saw crime as a relatively lucrative option to work, and who perceived the risk and the penalties of being caught as modest, had markedly lower chances of being in school or holding a job. Now, I've seen a video of some kids in Memphis saying that, hey, they rob people because they feel like it. It's a preferred lifestyle. You can make more money in a night robbing people than you can make working 2 weeks at a minimum wage job. And then being subsidized by welfare deters them from acquiring human capital that would make them more successful, thus contributing to the social pathology that's evident in cities all across the country, from Atlanta, Oakland, Chicago, Detroit, DC, Baltimore, Stockton, California, Wilmington, Delaware, Miami, New York City. One more example of this black depravity, this black criminality before I move on. In New York City, blacks are about a quarter of all of its population, yet they commit 66% of all violent crimes and 3/4 of all shootings. Blacks and Hispanics together commit 98% of all shootings in New York City. That's culture, man. It is culture. And until we call it out for what it is, until we shame adherents of this culture and we stop subsidizing them with our tax dollars that are confiscated by leftist Democrat politicians that gain power by keeping people poor and stupid, none of this will change. The bodies will continue to mount. The economic ruination will continue. So we have to stop it. We have to call it out for what it is, and we have to stop voting for the race hustlers and the preachers of resentment and envy that are the Democrats. Let me move on. I'm going to talk about the white British underclass now. In 1969, the out-of-wedlock birth rate in England was 8%. In 1979, it was 11%. In 1989, it was 25%. And by 1999, it was about 38%. In 1900, there were far more poor people in England, yet the illegitimacy rates and crime rates among the poor weren't as high as they were in later decades. And who do you think passed the soft crime laws and the huge welfare state that incentivizes failure and incompetence? The left. Welfare consists of 20% of their national budget. That is absurd. Big government. 1/8 of British adults have never worked a day in their lives. Only 7% of convicted criminals end up behind bars, and more than 2,100 offenders not serving jail time went on to commit further crimes in 2007. Like I said, when you subsidize any behavior, you get more of it. When people aren't punished for doing the wrong thing, they'll continue to do the wrong thing. Human beings are driven by incentives and deterrence. And when you give them perverse incentives, you will get perverse outcomes. It's not that hard to understand. The crime rate in Britain is 10,000 per 100,000. A far cry from the early 20th century when it was a far safer and far poorer country. So I'm going to give some examples from this great book, Life at the Bottom, The Worldview That Makes the Underclass by Theodore Dalrymple. He talks about the white underclass and their aversion to work, their disdain for education and civility, their adherence to cultural and moral relativism, and their propensity towards violence and criminality. So I'm gonna give you a few examples from this text. There is one great psychological advantage to the white underclass in their disdain for education. It enables them to maintain the fiction that the society around them is grossly, even grotesquely unjust, and that they themselves are the victims of this injustice. If, on the contrary, education were seen by them as a means available to all to rise in the world, as indeed it could be and is in many societies, their whole worldview would naturally have to change. Instead of attributing their misfortunes to others, they would have to look inward, which is always a painful process. Just like the black underclass. The white kids who do well in school in these ghetto neighborhoods in Britain, they get beaten up by other white kids because it disproves their worldview. You're buying into the vision of the enemy. If you can study and do well in school and succeed, that means that everything that they believe about the world is false, and they are responsible for their failure in life. And no one really wants to take responsibility for their failure in life. I just talked about how the black underclass blames everyone else for their criminality, for their illegitimacy, for their violence, and for their poor educational results. And the reality is, black people are succeeding in this country by doing the opposite of what they're doing. But by acknowledging the fact that blacks are very successful in this country, and that blacks that finish high school, get a full-time job, don't go to jail, and don't have a baby out of wedlock, the fact that blacks that do all those things stay out of poverty 98% of the time and are relatively successful and prosperous, that completely dismantles their worldview of systemic racism and white supremacy and all this garbage that's being sold to them by the mainstream media and by their leftist Democrat overlords. That actual change will never happen until they admit the truth. And most people, they don't like the truth. Let's give you some more examples from stories from Life at the Bottom. Here's some right here. She had never married, they're talking about a woman who was getting abused by her boyfriend. She had never married but had 2 other children. The first, a daughter aged 8, still lived with her. The father was a man whom she left because she had found he was having sex with 12-year-old girls. Her second child was a son whose father was an idiot with whom she had slept one night. That child, now 6, lived with the idiot, and she never saw him. What had her experience taught her? I don't want to think about it. The housing will charge me for the damage, and I ain't got the money. I'm depressed, doctor. I'm not happy. I want to move, to get away from him. Later in the day, feeling a little lonely, she telephoned her ex-boyfriend, and he visited her. I discussed the case with the doctor who had recently arrived from Madras, India, and who felt he had entered an insane world. Not in his wildest dream had he imagined it could be like this. There was nothing to compare it with in Madras. He asked me what would happen next to the happy couple. They'll find her a new flat. They'll buy her new furniture, television, and refrigerator, because it's unacceptable poverty in this day and age to live without them. They'll charge her nothing for the damage to her old flat, because she can't pay anyway, and it wasn't she who did it. He will get away scot-free. Once she's installed in her new flat to escape from him, she'll invite him there, he'll smash it up again, then they'll find her somewhere else to live. There is, in fact, nothing she can do that will deprive her from the state's obligation to house, feed, and entertain her. I asked the doctor from Madras if poverty was the word he would use to describe this woman's situation. He said it was not. That her behavior was that she accepted no limits. Her problem was that she accepted no limits to her own behavior, that she did not fear the possibility of hunger, the condemnations of her own parents or neighbors, or God. In other words, the squalor of England was not economic, but spiritual, moral, and cultural. Give you more examples from here. So this is the difference between the poor Indians that live in the slums and the poor whites that live in the slums. Frequents are piled with all kinds of attractive fresh produce that, by supermarket standards, is astonishingly cheap. The women take immense trouble over their purchases and make subtle discriminations. There are no pre-cooked meals for them. By contrast, a shop that poor whites patronize offers a restricted choice, largely of relatively expensive prepared foods that at most require only the addition of hot water. The difference between the two groups cannot be explained by differences in income. The willingness of Indians to take trouble over what they eat and to treat meals as important social occasions that impose obligations and at times require the subordination of personal desire toward life that often permits them, despite their current low incomes, to advance up the social scale. It's not poverty. And the little leftist academics and politicians that blame poverty, I've talked about this before, they are excusing irresponsibility and morally reprehensible behavior. By excusing their behavior, you're telling them that their behavior won't change unless their economic status changes. And the reality is, once their behavior changes, their economic status will change. So they have the whole thing backwards. Like I've said earlier, these problems of social pathology weren't nearly as prevalent in times of more poverty. Just excuses. Here's one right here. Last story. The morals of her story could have hardly been any clearer. First, the inhabitants of the milieu from which she came considered that her duty not to inform the authorities far outweighed her right to not be maltreated. Second, the authorities themselves considered the attack upon her as unworthy of serious attention. Third, she received no public help at all in escaping from the circumstances into which she had been born. To treat her as an especially deserving case, after all, would be to imply that there were undeserving cases. And to say that there were undeserving cases would be tantamount to admitting that one way of living is preferable morally, economically, culturally, spiritually to another. This is a thought that must at all costs be kept at bay, or the whole ideology of modern education and welfare collapses into a heap. There's another story about an older white lady who lived in the ghetto, and these kids would stuff excrement into her mailbox. And when she approached the parent of one of the juvenile delinquents, of course there's no father around, this single mother berated this woman and threatened her with violence. That happens in the black ghettos all the time. You can't tell these people anything. If you call the parents when they're misbehaving at school, especially if you're white, most of them will tell you, hey, when he's at school, he's your problem, or you're only picking on my son because he's black. No responsibility for their actions whatsoever. One more point on the English British white underclass. A 2013 study showed that among low-income children, Africans and children of Bangladesh origin met the test standards 60% of the time. Children of black immigrants of Caribbean origin met the standards just under 50% of the time. Poor native whites met the standards 30% of the time. So all the excuses that you hear about black dysfunction in America, discrimination, racism, all this other nonsense, does not apply to poor whites in Great Britain, but the commonalities are the same. It's unholy allegiance with these leftist politicians and the leftist intelligentsia that apologizes for their behavior, that teaches them the politics of resentment and envy, that no problems in their life are the fault of others. Everything is someone else's fault. They encourage them to go on welfare. They don't dare criticize their aberrant behavior, so on and so forth. And that's what you get. So let me go to the Maori Underclass in New Zealand. Let's move this forward. In 1898, while Maori made up 5% of the population, only 2.3% of charges were against Maori. That trend followed for the next 4 decades, but then Maori crime started to increase. Maori comprise about 14% of the general population, But by 2004, out of all convicted cases where the ethnicity of the offender was recorded, 45% were New Zealand whites, 43% were Maori, and 9% were Pacific peoples. For violent offending, Maoris committed 47% of the violent crime. Maori youth apprehension rates are 3 times greater than that of New Zealand Europeans. The great Maori leader, Sir Apirana Nagata, warned of the dangers that social welfare would bring to Maori, and it is completely sad that his predictions were entirely true. When you excuse people of the standards of civil society, and when you subsidize their failure and incompetence, and you tell them that the world is unjust and that they're owed something for nothing, and that all their problems are not internal but are external, these are the results you get, whether they're blacks in America, poor whites in England, Maori here in New Zealand, or my next topic will be the poor Hispanics here in America. The illegitimacy rate for Maori is over 70%. People who receive welfare as teenagers are the most vulnerable to become trapped in the system. What is particularly disturbing is that with over 10,000 young people aged 16 to 18 years old entering the welfare system every year, there's a strong likelihood that many will remain dependent on benefits in the long term. Figures produced by the working group show benefit dependence amongst Maori is more than double the rate for the population as a whole, with census figures from 2006 showing that 27% of Maori between the ages of 18 and 64 years old are receiving welfare benefits compared to 12% of the total population. 1 in 3 Maori women are on welfare, compared to 1 in 5 Maori men. In 2000, Bainan penned a cutting series on poverty in New Zealand, including a close look at Ruatoria. In Ruatoria, he was told, 90% of the households are on welfare. Ruatoria has one of the highest ratios of one-parent families. Like what I said, in the United States, 90% of welfare recipients are single mothers. Single mothers make up 19% of American families, but are 51% of all families in poverty. When you're born out of wedlock to a single mother, you're 5 times more likely to be poor, 20 times more likely to go to jail, 3 times more likely to fail in school. The vast majority of people in our prisons, in gangs, on drugs, in every negative social pathology you can think of, the vast majority of them come from single-parent homes. Matriarchal cultures are dysfunctional. The black culture in America today is matriarchal. That's why it's in chaos. The same thing with the British underclass culture. Matriarchal, in chaos. The Maori culture. Matriarchal. Dysfunctional. And all the Maori leaders, they do the same thing that the black race hustlers do in America. They blame all the problems on discrimination, racism, systematic oppression, all these leftist communist buzzwords that they throw out. But as the evidence shows, their illegitimacy rates and their crime rates will lower when they were poorer and face more discrimination. The difference in income between Maori is bigger than the difference between the income of Maori and whites. It's a culture problem, and until those people are honest with themselves and talk about the negative aspects of going on welfare, not studying in school, having babies out of wedlock, and being involved in crime and drugs, so on and so forth, the situation will never change. I was reading something else about the Maori that showed that the Maori, they have affirmative action for the Maori as well, and a lot of those kids that get affirmative action, they miss class more on average than the kids who aren't on affirmative action. You can guide a horse to the water, but you can't make him drink. The last underclass I'm going to talk about is the one that's particularly chilling to me. I think it's the most pertinent one in American society today, especially in my home state of California. And if current trends continue, this is the underclass that can ruin the country. So here we go. This is the American Hispanic underclass. The LA, Anaheim, Long Beach area now has the highest poverty rate in the country at 20.5%. The state of California has the highest poverty rate in the country. It has 12% of the U.S. population, but has 1/3 of all welfare recipients. $103 billion are spent on welfare annually in California. 49% of the state's food stamp recipients are Hispanic. 59% of food stamp recipients in LA County are Hispanic. The illegitimacy rate for Hispanics is 53%. The incarceration rate for second-generation Hispanics is 8 times the rate for the first generation. By 2050, if current trends continue, Hispanics will be a quarter of the U.S. population and by far the majority population in California. So let me give you some tidbits from Victor Davis Hanson, a great scholar. Some tidbits from his article, Do We Want Mexifornia? Let me give you some quotes here from this. Quote, the tragedy is that though illegal aliens come here hoping to succeed, most get no preparation for California's competitive culture. Instead, their activist shepherds herd them into ethnic enclaves where exorbitably they congeal into an underclass. The concept of multiculturalism is the force multiplier that produces this result. It transforms a stubborn problem of assimilation into a social calamity. Give you some more quotes. My sleepy hometown of Selma, California is the dead center of all this. The once rural San Joaquin Valley community has grown from 7,000 to nearly 20,000 in a mere 2 decades as a result of mostly illegal immigration from Mexico. Selma is now somewhere between 60 to 90% Hispanic. In the old days, he used to worry about the theft of a tractor battery. But in the last decade, this is in his words, I have run off at gunpoint 3 gang members trying to force their way into our house at 3 a.m. Last year, 4 patrol cars, accompanied by a helicopter whirling overhead, chased drug dealers in hot pursuit through our driveway. One suspect escaped and turned up 2 hours later, hiding behind a hedge on our lawn, vainly seeking sanctuary from a sure prison term. When a carload of thieves tried to steal oranges from our yard, I soon found myself outmanned and outgunned, and decided that 100 pounds of pilfered fruit is not worth your life. Another good quote. Talking about the illegals. They use their counterfeit documentations to get on workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, and state assistance to garner what their weary bodies can no longer earn. And LA County is notorious for not checking immigration status when people are applying to food stamps, because if you didn't know, listeners, we are a sanctuary state. We disobey federal law. We aid and abet criminals. We confiscate the rightful property of hardworking, legal, tax-paying citizens and give it to those who does not belong, especially illegals, because the leftist Democrats know what they did to the blacks 50 years ago by conning them into believing that government's their friend and that the only way that they can succeed is by relying on government and taking handouts and being completely immoral. And that's what's happening to the Hispanics, and it's going to lead to chaos and dysfunction. So let's continue this quote. Meanwhile, they romanticize a distant Mexico while chastising an ever-present America. And the second generation has learned how to spend, live, and consume as Americans, but not, like their fathers, to work and save as Mexicans. If rising crime rates, gang activity, and illegitimacy are any indication, many now resent rather than sacrifice to escape their poverty. Another quote. Census data shows us that median household income by the mid-90s had risen for a decade for all groups except for the nation's Hispanics, whose incomes dropped 5.1%. Although recent immigrants from Mexico and the U.S.-born children under 18 now officially make up only 4.2% of America's population, they represent 10.2% of our poor. When you add in long-time accounts, Hispanics account for 24% of America's impoverished, up 8 percentage points since 1985. The true causes of checkered progress continual and massive illegal immigration of cheap labor that drives down wages for working Hispanics here, failure to learn English, the collapse of the once strong Hispanic family due to federal entitlement, soaring birth rates among a demoralized underclass, an intellectual elite that downplays social pathology, claims perpetual racism, and seeks constant government largesse and entitlement, and years of bilingual education that ensures dependency upon a demagogic leadership are rarely mentioned. That sounds like the black underclass. I mean, blacks are rising out of poverty quickly in 20 years. They went from 87% being in poverty in 1940 to 47% being in poverty in 1960. They're doing very well for themselves. And once they sold their soul to the Democrats that promised them a bunch of free stuff, that told them that all their problems are due to the larger society, that's when it started to go downhill. Blacks were climbing out of poverty, but at a slower rate than they were doing before. The out-of-wedlock births exploded. The crime exploded. The schools started failing like there were no tomorrow. And that's how we are where we are today. And the Hispanic establishment, along with the Democrat Party, is doing the same thing to the Hispanics. Okay, let's get some more quotes here. Our schools, through multiculturalism, cultural relativism, and therapeutic curriculum, often promote the very tribalism, statism, and group rather than individual interests that our new immigrants are fleeing from. If taken to heart, such ideas lead our new arrivals to abject failure in California, and a lot of them are abject failures. I live in LA. This LA's third world. A lot of places are third world. Go to MacArthur Park. Like, that's not the United States of America, dude. Go to East LA. It's not America. Okay. So those are quotes from the late great, well, he's not late great, he's still alive, from the great Victor Davis Hanson. So now I'm going to read you some quotes from the great Heather McDonald on the extent of this Hispanic underclass pathology. This is a quote from the Heather McDonald article entitled Hispanic Family Values. Dr. Ana Sanchez delivers babies at St. Joseph's Hospital in the city of Orange, California, many of them to Hispanic teenagers. To her dismay, they view having a child at their age as normal. A recent patient just had her second baby at age 17. The baby's father is in jail. But what is most alarming, Sanchez says, is that the teen's parents view having babies outside of marriage as normal too. A lot of the grandmothers are single as well. They never married or they had successive partners. So the mom sends a message to her daughter that it's okay to have children out of wedlock. Sanchez feels almost personally involved in the problem. I'm Hispanic myself. I wish I could find out what the Asians are doing right. She guesses that Asian parents' passion for education inoculates their children against teen pregnancy in the underclass trap. Hispanics are not picking that up like the Asian kids, she sighs. Another quote from the article. Another quote. Amy Braun works for Mary's Shelter, a home for young single mothers who are homeless or in crisis in Orange County, California. It has become culturally okay for the Hispanic population to use shelter and welfare, Braun says. A case manager at a program for pregnant homeless women in the city of Orange observes the same acculturation to the social service sector with its grievance mongering and sense of victimhood. I'll have women in my office on their fifth child when the others have already been placed in foster care, says Anita Berry of Casa Teresa. There's nothing shameful about having multiple children that you can't care for and be pregnant again, because then you can blame the system. And I'm telling you this is chilling because I see Hispanic underclass behavior in LA. They don't really value education on average. If you go to a predominantly Hispanic school, most predominantly Hispanic schools are failing education-wise. They're failing education-wise because we're importing mass poverty, legally and illegally, into our state, and also that their culture really doesn't value education, especially as much as whites or Asians. You see a lot of these kids, these Hispanic kids, middle, high school, what do they like to do? Skateboard, smoke weed, tag, get girls pregnant, hit on girls. for a good amount of these young Hispanic males and females, education is the last of their concerns. I mean, I've seen it. I mean, go to certain high schools like Belmont High School. A lot of these kids aren't trying to learn. They're not. Because if they were, their levels of failure would not be as high. Their high school dropout rates wouldn't be as high. Their illegitimacy rates wouldn't be as high. And the biggest problem with this is that the leftist establishment, the La Raza types, the public sector unions, the public sector establishments have every incentive to not correct this pathological Hispanic behavior, because like they've seen with the blacks, they know that telling these Hispanics that all their problems are due to the larger society, by telling them that they are owed something for nothing, by not correcting their aberrant behavior that keeps them in poverty, is going to create more poverty, is going to create more government dependence, and all the public service sector unions and the public service sector bureaucracies are going to be able to use these poor Hispanics as cannon fodder for their political gain. They're going to grow government. They're going to point to these poor Hispanics and say, hey, we need more taxes to fund our schools because of these poor Hispanics. They're going to grow government. They're going to deter business growth because California is already the least friendly state to businesses. We already have the highest income tax in the country. We have some of the worst ranked schools in the country. And unfortunately, I don't see that changing. We owe about $700 billion in unfunded liabilities to union members. And the Hispanics, they're already falling in the Democrat trap. 70% of them vote Democrat. 70% of all single mothers vote Democrat. And by this proliferation of bastardy, school failure, resentment, and envy, these leftist Democrats are going to extract even more taxpayer dollars. They're going to enact even more burdensome regulations. They're going to take even more control over the private sector. And this state is really going to slide further and further into the abyss. There's been a mass exodus out of California for at least 10 years. And it's not stopping. If you look at Detroit, for example, they went through the same thing. They increased the entitlement programs. They were soft on crime. They pandered to the unions, and they raised the capital gains tax. So all the productive people eventually left, and most of the good jobs left because they couldn't turn a profit because labor costs were too expensive. And that's what's happening here in California. We're gonna have a $15 minimum wage here in 2020, which is gonna price more people, especially poor Hispanics, out the market. Those Hispanics are gonna go on welfare. They're not going to acquire any skills that people are willing to pay for, so they're going to stay poor. They're going to vote for the political party that enables their incompetence, their slovenliness, their immorality. They're going to vote for the political party that doesn't deport them, that gives illegals all these entitlements, that says that they're on their side. And the reality is it's going to create more poverty, more crime, more dysfunction, and more government dependence. So the moral of my story is, when it comes to the underclass, none of these behaviors lead to success. If you look at these cities all across the country, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Oakland, LA, these cities are going down the drain because their entitlement class keeps growing, and the public sector is growing at a rate faster than the private sector. They will eventually run out of other people's money. They enact minimum wage laws that price people out the labor market. They extort taxpayers to subsidize counterproductive behavior, which leads to more counterproductive behavior, which is good for them because it leads to more votes. They trap these kids in failing government schools so that the school districts profit, the teachers profit, and the Hispanics and the blacks suffer. So my implications would be, we have to call this behavior out for what it is. We have to talk about how much of a burden it is to the taxpayer and to the society, how much crime negatively affects economic growth and safety, how illegitimacy is the number one cause of poverty today in our country, how no minority group has ever risen from poverty to prosperity by becoming dependent on government, by not acquiring marketable skills, by blaming all their problems on others, by having a bunch of bastards that they can't pay for, and by not valuing education. I'm telling you, California will become Hispanic Detroit if we don't stop this. You have people like Libby Schaff in Oakland actively disobeying federal law by telling illegal criminals that ICE is coming and telling them to hide. The leftist Democrats want to continue to raise taxes, and they're going to use these poor Hispanics as cannon fodder to enact their agenda of economic ruination, crime, and degeneracy. We're heading to become Greece or Detroit or any other society that stopped relying on the free market, that grew the scope of government and thought that they can tax and spend their way to prosperity. It does not work. So if you really want to help these people, you have to tell them that the way that they live is wrong. You cannot be afraid to stand up for our values of individual responsibility, self-sufficiency, family, education, and small government. The underclass is a huge problem in our country, in countries across the world, and it is leading us to financial insolvency. That's the Lord Gord Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe on iTunes, YouTube, Podbean, so on and so forth. Share it with your friends. Donate on Patreon. Get the Lord Gord album, This Isn't TV, on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, whatever. If you're in LA, come to the Blues Jam every Tuesday. Free admission. It's 21 and over. $1 tacos. Open mic. Come out and have a good time. Next week, I'm going to talk about price theory, the role of prices in a free market, and why free markets that don't regulate prices, that don't have government regulated prices, that let prices be affected by producers and consumers, lead to prosperity and have gotten more people out of poverty and have created more goods and services than any other economic system in the history of the world. I am Lord Gord. I'll see you next time.